at a slower rate.
Yep, I think we can get started, Nick.
Alrighty, here we go.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Nick Solovich of Subprime Auto Finance News and Buy Here Pay Here Reports. In today's webinar, Informing Auto Financing Decisions Using Economic Insight, we're going to learn more about this topic from Dr. Tony Hughes, the Managing Director of Specialized Modeling at Moody's Analytics. And if you've read materials from Auto Remarketing and Subprime Auto Finance News, Dr. Hughes has been one of our resources and contributing authors to our publications as an expert in this particular subject. So we're very glad to have him today. But before we get started, I want to go over a few housekeeping items for today's webinar. Please make sure you've dialed in using the phone number provided in your communication email, or you're able to listen via your PC speakers. We are recording today's webinar, and we'll make that recording available to you in the coming days. You'll be in listen-only mode for this webinar, but we will reserve some time after Dr. Tony's presentation for a question and answer session. You can submit your questions at any time through the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel. And if we run out of time and can't get to your question today, don't worry, because we'll forward it on to the team at Moody's Analytics so they can respond back to you directly via email. And finally, if you have any difficulty during the webinar, please click on the hand icon to alert a member of our team. So let's learn more about informing auto financing decisions using economic insight with Dr. Tony Hughes of Moody's Analytics. Dr. Hughes, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Nick, and I'd like to thank everyone on the call for making the time to join. I hope you find today's presentation informative. So let me just start by telling you a little bit about my background. I should say I am Australian, if anyone's wondering where my accent comes from. But I've been in the US now for over a decade. My background, I've been working primarily on issues of bank stress testing, and that experience has very much informed the work that I'm going to talk about today. So over the last several years, as part of what's known as the CCAR process, which is stress tests of the largest banks in the country, Moody's Analytics has been very much involved in helping those institutions to be able to clear regulatory hurdles. And as part of that, me and my various teams have done a lot of work in stress testing credit losses for various banks and captive finance companies. And over the last few years, there's been an increased focus on loss given default projections under different economic scenarios. And then also for those with lease portfolios, there's been a very keen interest in developing methodologies for stress testing residual risk. And as part of that work, we have been developing these models in coordination with our banking clients. And we feel that the methodologies and some of the features of the approach that's taken in addressing those regulatory concerns may be of significant interest to a broader slice of the auto remarketing industry. So to give you a little, so that's just a quick bio slide. So I am an econometrician and worked on basically a full range of credit risk problems, but with a strong focus on retail type exposures. So that's mortgage and credit card, as well as the auto sector. And over the last few years, I have been much more interested in auto finance and developing tools for use in that important sector of the economy. Where we're ending up today is this is the type of output that you'll see more of throughout the presentation. What we see here is a chart that shows forecasts of wholesale value for a Lexus RX 350. This is a 2015 model, and this is projections of residual value in green under a baseline scenario. So here, what we're doing is taking the forecast that my erstwhile boss Mark Zandi develops and defends in public, and we're applying it through our residual price model to develop a baseline forecast for the future value of the Lexus. And then juxtaposed with that, we have a projection that assumes a very severe recession event. In this case, it's unemployment rate heading back towards 10%. We've got the Fed cutting interest rates. Really just a dire macroeconomic scenario, very much akin to what we saw during the Great Recession. And you can see that there's a very profound impact that occurs to the value of the Lexus RX 350 under that type of scenario. The other point to note here is that you'll see that the price does rebound once the dust has settled following the severe economic shock, and we observe the price of the RX actually rising above baseline towards the back end of the recession. And this is a result of supply variations that are caused by the recession. So the recession leads to a very strong deterioration in new vehicle sales, and that basically generates a supply shadow on the back end of the recession. So that's where we're ending up. I always like to sort of give a preview of the conclusion at the outset, and I've got a few quiz questions that we're also going to run, polling questions that we're going to use to try to keep you interested and entertained throughout the next 35, 40 minutes or so. The agenda, therefore, that I'll follow today, I'll just give you just a quick discussion of some of the insights that we've gleaned from our work in the regulatory landscape, and talk about basically the benefits that we see stemming from taking a very purely quantitative approach to residual forecasting and stress testing. I'll talk a little bit about the structure of the model and how we went about developing it. But the main focus today is going to be on showing you some of the results from the model and comparing responses of a few different vehicles and showing how they're likely to behave under a range of different alternative macroeconomic scenarios. So with that, what I'll do is just talk a little bit about the industry landscape. So as I mentioned earlier, we've sort of come out of a risk management tradition, and especially in terms of developing stress tests for the purpose of regulatory stress testing in the United States. The regulators have required the banks to take a very specific approach to their forecasts of basically any cash flow that might be material to the behavior and performance of the bank under a stress event. And that certainly includes losses given default of auto loans and also residual risk related to leasing portfolios as well. The Fed, the regulators, require the banks to own the any subjective content that goes into producing the outcomes of the stress test. So what this means is that the banks must have a purely quantitative model that they are able to run through a full validation exercise. They have to be able to fully understand all of the inner workings of the model that's used to produce the stress projections. They're still able to apply a subjective element in the construction of the final forecast, especially if there are, some idiosyncratic features that are difficult to quantify in the construction of the quantitative model. But the bank officials are required to be able to fully understand and fully explain how they went about deriving those subjective assessments. And so as a result of this has led to the development of these purely quantitative approaches to these types of problems that then allow the banks to own any subjective assessment of the underlying problem at hand. So now we feel that this type of feature also has application for other potential users in the industry. So one observation that I would make is that it's true that in residual assessment the subjective element is very important. But what I've known from talking to a myriad of different people in the auto industry is that they all have a very keen understanding of vehicles and what makes them tick and various sort of idiosyncratic shocks that are hitting the auto industry at various times. In other words, car people know cars. And so the point about what we're trying to do here is we're saying that we have certainly an understanding of macro cycles, of supply and demand conditions at the industry level, and interactions between the auto industry and the broader macro economy. And so we feel that we can provide a very interesting and useful macroeconomic projection of residual values to the industry. The follow-on from that is that because car people know cars, they can then own the subjective element just like the banks under regulatory scrutiny. Okay, and then they can derive a number of follow-on benefits that stem from being able to access a purely quantitative modeling approach in the assessment of residuals. So just to give you an example of what I mean by this subjective element, just to give you a sense of what I mean by this subjective element, so what I want to do is just give you a brief example of this. And this actually comes from my own home country, okay, of Australia. These are two vehicles that were marketed in the mid-90s down under. They're Ford Falcon. It's just a full-sized family sedan. Very popular vehicles in Australia. At various times they've been the market leader in terms of sales in Australia. So the most popular vehicle brand. So one of these vehicles, the cars are mechanically identical, and the basic drivetrains and so forth are, there wasn't a material upgrade made to the model through this period, but they did make cosmetic changes. And the question then is, one of these vehicles turned out to be a flop in the market, and the other one was hugely successful, just like preceding models of this car and following subsequent models of this car. So the question to the audience is, can you identify which of these vehicles was a flop? Just to give you a couple of comments while people are filling in their answers, you'll notice that the EA Falcon up in the top right-hand corner has rounded headlights. I should say these pictures were just taken from Wikipedia. I think this is fair use. I certainly hope it is. You can tell it's Australia because both photos are taken in the desert. It's bone dry in both photos. So you'll notice that the EA Falcon has rounded headlights. It has the smaller radiator air intake opening. But fundamentally, the two vehicles are identical. You'll notice that the AU Falcon has the pointed headlights, the waterfall grille, and a bump that was put into well, what would be called the bonnet in Australia, or the what is that? The hood. Yeah, I knew it was something like that. Sorry, I don't speak American that well. Okay, Nick, have we got answers to our poll? Have we got any responses? So I guess I can share the poll results.
They are up on the screen now, Tony.
Okay. So interestingly enough, it was roughly evenly split. You can see that 44% said the EA was the flop, and 56% said the AU. So I'm pleased to announce that the democracy works. Okay, and the audience knows their cars, because the correct answer actually is the AU. So basically, you know, the marketplace responded very negatively to the cosmetic changes that were made to the AU, and sales, both new and residual values, both suffered tremendously in subsequent years. And just as an aside, just to give you a sense of my personal sensibilities, I've owned one of these vehicles, and it turns out that the vehicle I've owned is the AU. So I bought the flop, if you will, and what that tells you about me is that I don't care so much about cosmetics. Okay, I just want to get a cheap, you know, good, solid mechanical car. Okay, so but I guess the other lesson from this is that you know, auto industry insiders, okay, it's very difficult to make these types of subjective assessments. And you know, one thing that I like to point out here is that the Ford executives who designed the AU, which was the vehicle that is the most recent of these two, they thought that they were going to improve the vehicle, and the executives who signed off on the redesign also thought that they were improving the vehicle. And so these are auto industry insiders, and yet they made an error in assessing the value of the vehicle. Unfortunately, just like 44% of the callers on today's event. Anyway, so moving on, if I can, I think I've got to click again. So the other way to think about this is that a purely quantitative approach is a bit like a Moneyball type solution. So the idea is that we're trying to be purely quantitative and provide a purely model-driven projection of the value of the vehicle. Now, I've already said that subjective assessment of vehicles is very important, and many people on the call today, you know, would be able to make a very highly informed, astute assessment of the subjective value of the vehicles. But nonetheless, even if it turns out that the subjective assessments are valuable, what we've realized from the stress testing exercises is that a number of additional benefits still will flow. So for example, by being purely quantitative, we're able to be completely transparent about the drivers of the forecasts. And so one of the points from the stress testing exercises is that clients require us to be completely transparent about the nature of the model, right down to providing the precise specification of the model that's used in deriving the forecasts. As I mentioned before, this means that users can own the subjective overlay, but it also provides, because it's purely transparent and quantitative, it's then possible to do a very rigorous back test and validation exercise with respect to the model and quantify precisely any value that's provided by the model. You can also then apply the model for other purposes on top of just standard baseline residual forecasting into other avenues like sensitivity analysis and stress testing. So what this means is that if the forecast changes, so if we think that a particular model is going to be at 55% of MSRP one month and that rises to 58% the following month, it's possible for us to state precisely what has changed to bring about that alteration in the forecast. We can say that it's because the macroeconomic environment has improved or deteriorated, as the case may be, or we can state that a particular coefficient driving a certain feature of the vehicles in the model has been updated, and as a result of that, the forecast was, had to change. So these additional benefits. The other benefit, of course, is that we can provide a complete documentation of all of the drivers and all of the inner workings of the model to the users at the end of the day as well. Our experience tells us that regulators increasingly require these features, and we feel that other users in the industry could also potentially benefit from them. To give you some brief background into the model, the models are obviously formulated with a view to doing macroeconomic stress testing, and so we are very acutely aware of trying to identify cyclical drivers of behavior. And so, various measures of the macroeconomy, employment levels, household income, these types of variables feature very prominently in the model. Interest rate movements and credit availability are also very important drivers of behavior of residual prices, and those types of variables are included. The supply side is obviously a very important driver of residual values, and we've got a range of different supply variables in the model that we're able to stress, and that's they're the type of variables that lead to features like we saw with the Lexus, where we ended up with a supply shadow that caused the price to rise above baseline in the recovery phase following a very deep recession. And the other point, of course, is that gas prices are very important in determining substitution between various adjacent brands, and we'll see that as we move into some of the examples that we've got coming up. Vehicle characteristics. So we do observe vehicles at the 11-digit VIN level. The data is sourced from AuctionNet, we observe a range of different trim features. We can capture things like drivetrain differences, style types, various sail types, as well as key vehicle characteristics like observed mileage. We can capture things like the region of sale, so we can allow the projections to vary based on the location in which the vehicle is likely to be sold. So a vehicle that's sold in California may yield a distinct residual forecast when compared to a similar vehicle that's sold in Florida. So these vehicle features and various other factors that I've just described are allowed to interact with different elements from the macroeconomy. So what this means is that different vehicle features may tend to be more popular among consumers during recessions. So consumers are looking for different types of vehicles at different points in the economic cycle. So during a boom, they may tend to be more aspirational or more sort of recreational in their vehicle choices, whereas during a recession, they may tend to be a little bit more cautious and more, looking for something that will reliably get them from A to B. The applications of this model we do think that there are applications to both loans and leases, and in fact, indeed, we've been speaking to a range of people across the industry, and but there seems to be a very strong interest in applications of this model, both in terms of front-end pricing and in terms of back-end risk management. So with that, I think we should get into a few more numerical examples. And so with that in mind, what we're going to do here is I'm going to show you a couple of vehicle pairs, okay? And here what we've got is the Toyota Corolla and the Toyota Prius. So similar vehicles in many respects. They're small, reliable cars. In this case, I've chosen two vehicles that are about 4 years old, right at the minute, and we're forecasting across the horizon there out to about the end of 2019. Here you can see the baseline forecasts for these two vehicles. So you can see that the Prius seems to hold its value slightly better than the Corolla. So the Prius starts from a slightly lower starting point, but it ends up at the end of the forecast horizon slightly above the value of the Corolla. But we did choose these vehicles so that they would exhibit a similar baseline forecast. I should say as well that the forecasts here are represented in price to MSRP terms, and that should be fairly familiar to all of the people on the call. So the next polling question, therefore, is, all right, and I better make sure I get the wording of the question right. Okay, so the question is, which of these vehicles is more acutely affected by an oil price shock, or how are these vehicles affected by an oil price shock? I should just give you some color here. The oil price shock I'm referring to is a holistic oil price shock. We're not just saying that oil prices are now higher, but everything else remains the same. We're saying that oil prices are higher, and that has a subsequent effect on the behavior of the broader economy. Okay, so it's a more sort of holistic thing. Okay, so the question is, do both vehicles appreciate in value? Do both vehicles continue to depreciate in value? Or do we have a situation where the Prius appreciates while the Corolla stagnates? Okay, I see the votes coming in. Okay, I'll sort of, okay, I think Nick's closed off the voting, but that's fine. We got a good response there. And you can see that 30% of people said that both vehicles will appreciate in value. 11% thought both vehicles will depreciate in value, like under the baseline. And then 59% of people said that the Prius will appreciate while the Corolla will stagnate. Well, again, I'm glad to see that the majority picked the correct answer, or at least the answer that agrees with our model, I should say. And what we find is that the Prius actually does substantially appreciate in value. Interestingly enough, when we run the Chevy Volt in the same way, we find an even stronger effect of oil prices. So obviously, what's going on here is the Prius is clearly a very good fuel economy vehicle, and as a result of that, people are substituting from other vehicles into the Prius during a period of high elevated gas prices. The Corolla actually also holds up very well. Okay, it's also a very fuel-efficient vehicle, and as a result of that, but nonetheless, I think it's fair to say that the price of the Corolla does stagnate. Okay, while the Prius appreciates. So I would argue that the correct answer here is C. I guess technically the 30% who said A, they might be able to have an argument with my assessment, but nevertheless. So anyway, those are the results, and I think that the point here is that while it is fairly intuitive that the Prius will tend to rise in value during periods of high oil prices, sometimes it's a little bit hard to actually quantify the extent of that effect. okay, and using our model, we are able to, give you a very good, again, validatable, back-testable assessment of just how much the Prius is likely to appreciate in value following this type of shock. Okay, moving on, you can see as well in this situation that the effect of the supply shadow and the recovery period here is also quite distinct. Okay, and so in this situation, we've got the case where basically demand for these vehicles has risen during the period of the shock. Okay, and then in the recovery phase, we get an overshoot in the prices as the vehicle as the situation recovers back to the baseline situation. Okay, the next query relates to a comparison between the Camry and the Mercedes-Benz. This is quite an older vehicle. Again, we do have some newer vehicles coming up. So, but I guess one side note is that it is possible to use the model that we've got here for for assessing the behavior of used vehicles, which may lead to an application for used vehicle leasing as well. So here we have a luxury vehicle, a Mercedes-Benz SL, and we're comparing that to a Toyota Camry. You can see the baseline forecasts on the screen already, with the Camry in green and the Mercedes in orange. We do have another poll question. I think it's the last of the poll questions. I figured that this might get a bit stale after a while, but nevertheless, one more. So the question here is, I've already sort of been discussing the fact that that luxury vehicles may tend to take a fairly hard hit during a very severe recession. So the question here is, which of these vehicles will get hit harder by a recession? Okay, the Camry or the Mercedes? And I'm not sure what the order of the vehicle, the responses is here. I can't actually see it. Let me see if I can open the question a bit better. Okay, all right, there we go. So, okay, so it's just basically 0 to 10%, and then 10 to 30 or 30 to 50%. And we've actually had a better response here. Thank you for your votes. Roughly 60% of people have voted, and 48% of people said between 10 and 30%. 20% said 0 to 10%, and 32% of people said between 30 and 50%, just in terms of the Mercedes-Benz. It turns out that in this case, the luxury vehicle actually does take a very severe hit. I need to click again. There we go. And so if you take the complete effect of the severe recession, peak to trough, okay, it turns out that the answer C is the correct answer. So it's roughly a 40% decline in the initial residual value of the Mercedes SL from the start of the event to its peak, to its nadir, if you will. So what we find is that luxury cars tend to be very hard hit, and as I mentioned in the preamble to this discussion, this is because the luxury vehicles they fit into a very luxury used vehicles, I should add. They fall into a fairly unusual niche in the auto industry broadly, because rich people tend to be relatively unaffected by recession. So they tend to be so what we find is that sales of new luxury vehicles will tend to not be hit so hard by the onset of a recession, but luxury used vehicles tend to be an aspirational purchase for more sort of more middle class people, and those people, when times are tough, will tend to substitute more for reliable family vehicles, much like the Camry. So, and the Camry is actually a very, very solid vehicle in recession. It has a relatively, the recession has a relatively subdued effect on the valuation of the Camry. There are actually some vehicles out there that that appreciate, relative to baseline. They don't appreciate period, but they appreciate relative to baseline under a severe recession event. There's a couple of Subaru models like the Forester that tends to do very, very well during a recession. So that gives you a sort of an idea of this, and it turns out that some of these shocks caused by recession are highly material to the value of vehicles, and they can have a very profound impact at the portfolio level on valuations of cars. So moving on though, let's have just one more sort of double pronged mini quiz, if you will. Here we have two vehicles. One of them, the green line, you can see is sort of rock solid in terms of its observed residuals over time, and one vehicle is following a more traditional path towards depreciation. One of these vehicles is a Hummer, okay, 1997 Hummer H1, and the other one is a 1997 Honda Civic. The question is which one of these tends to retain its value, and it turns out that the Hummer retains its value incredibly well under baseline circumstances. The reason for this is just that there's very few substitutes to the Hummer. If you're an enthusiast, you will tend to go out and buy a Hummer, okay, and as a result, and supply of these types of vehicles is very subdued. So as a result of that, you observe the Hummer being very well behaved under baseline circumstances. But under a recession, what you find is that the so if we now extend that example to the case where a severe recession hits, what we find is that the Hummer actually takes a very, very big hit during the recession. And this is sort of because of some of those same characteristics. So it is a recreational type vehicle. It's a vehicle that that is, you can almost think of people buying Hummers as being similar to those people who buy RVs or boats. And so they are recreational vehicles. So they are a luxury item that tends to be, in very, very weak demand during a recession event. Okay, I think we got one more example here. I think I might skip over the last example because I think this is getting a little bit stale. Hopefully people are still interested. Here we just have two more commercial vehicles. We've got a light truck, an F-150, and then a GMC van, okay, which is a G1500 van. And you can see their baseline projections there. They're following a very similar path under baseline. This one is a little bit less visually stunning, but I think it is still an important example to demonstrate. So they're both very heavy gas users, and the question is which vehicle gets hit harder by a spike in gas prices. And it turns out that, and this is a little bit more subtle, but you can see that the orange line, the gap between the two orange lines here, which is the F-150, is somewhat smaller at the peak of the effect of the gas price shock than the gap between the green lines, which is the GMC. So the GMC van gets hit somewhat harder by oil prices, and that's certainly true in relative terms because obviously the GMC is coming off a lower base in terms of price to MSRP ratio. So it falls by a much higher percentage of its initial value prior to the economic shock. The other point to note here is that if you go to the recovery phase, what you notice is that both vehicles recover, but the F-150 actually overshoots its baseline forecast during the recovery phase. So the GMC sort of just goes back to baseline and sort of continues its previously established path at that point, but the F-150 overshoots the baseline in the recovery phase and actually appreciates in value through the recovery phase as gas prices normalize and go back to where they are today. That's assuming that today's gas prices are normal, of course. Okay, there is one additional example in there which compares the Audi R8 with the Audi A3, and it turns out that the R8 has better, retains its value better under baseline circumstances, but of course takes a bigger hit during a protracted recession event and then recovers more strongly back to its original baseline path. Okay, so that's just a further example of the fact that different vehicles can have quite different responses to a macroeconomic shock of different nature. So in the seminar today, I mean, I focused on two different types of shocks. Basically, a severe recession event on the one hand, and a severe upward gas price shock on the other. But we would like to note that we have built the models out to be able to cover an extremely wide range of different scenarios. So we can run basically, you know, interest rate scenarios, the Fed, you know, increasing rates, or a situation where rates go negative. We can certainly and have run the regulatory scenarios that the Fed puts out each year. We've done a full range of idiosyncratic scenarios for a range of clients. This is where they you know, assess the types of risks that are most material to the well-being of the institution, and then design a scenario with those types of events in mind. So we can do that type of analysis as well. The other point I'd make just in closing, and I do have a few summary remarks here. The other point I'd make in closing is that while I've sort of concentrated in today's talk on the effect of individual vehicles, and I think that's sort of the most straightforward way to demonstrate the behavior of the model and how the model reacts to different shocks. It should be pointed out that, of course, you know, we are primarily set up to do this type of analysis at a portfolio level, and we have a range of tools that we can use to, you know, run a complete portfolio through the model, and then do various types of portfolio level analyses, like assessing total credit losses and so forth. So just to make a couple of very brief, you know, summary remarks. So what we've done is we've developed a purely quantitative approach, which brings a number of benefits we feel. One of which is that it's very hard to beat a purely quantitative model in terms of pure forecast accuracy. But even if it is possible to beat the model, it still provides a number of additional benefits. And those benefits are primarily in the form of the ability to do a full court press on validation and sensitivity analysis, so being able to predict how the model will respond to different shocks, being able to own the subjective element in the forecast, okay, and then also being able to apply the model, apply the framework in the context of things like stress testing, where we're looking at alternative sets of macroeconomic events. Okay, so with that, I'll turn back to Nick, and we'll put it out to the audience. Thank you again for listening, and I'll ask if there are any questions for me.
Great presentation, Dr. Hughes, and for those who are interested, please use the questions box, as many others have on the GoToWebinar control panel to submit your question. And if you'd like to hear more of what Moody's Analytics and Dr. Hughes and his team are compiling, he's one of our many experts who's coming to Used Car Week, our series of live events that's set for November 14th through the 18th at the Red Rock Resort and Casino in Las Vegas. Dr. Hughes is going to be part of a panel discussion elaborating about these topics and more. And the timing is appropriate because our early bird registration discount expires tomorrow. where you can get $200 off the potential to join us out in Las Vegas. More details are at usedcarweek.biz if you'd like to hear more from Dr. Hughes and the folks at Moody's Analytics. And Dr. Hughes, just to start off our conversation, just what's your sense of how auto finance has been perceived by the markets in the last year or two? Are more investment entities, more finance companies interested, and more banks interested in auto finance as compared to the past couple of years? Just what's your sense of how thirsty the market is for auto financing?
I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, from our perspective, I mean, I think that the regulators have had a profound effect on the behavior of banks, certainly. You know, we've seen, we've seen, for example, on the mortgage side, that banks have been very loath to, to be very aggressive in growing their mortgage books. Partially, I think that's because of the regulatory response and the capital requirements that are imposed on banks in doing that type of business. And I'd say that auto financing has probably benefited from that trend a little bit over the last few years, and certainly growth in the auto sector has been quite strong through to probably the start of 2016. In 2016, it has eased off a little bit, but I think that's probably a welcome development in general. So, I think that the market recovered very well from the Great Recession, and and I think that sort of the level of activity in the auto sector is probably appropriate at the moment, if that's a reasonable answer. There has been obviously a very strong focus on leasing over the last few years, and that does bring some risks to the sector. But what I would say is that overall the the level of demand in the auto sector, I think, is at about the right level, and is unlikely to cause any significant problems in the industry.
Well, very good segues into one of the questions that's come in referencing risk and connection to the mortgage space. A questioner is wondering what kind of insights into how the modeling process will provide some assistance with a potential risk-sharing mechanism that could be evolved similar to what's been proposed in the mortgage space. Just how might an auto finance component kind of evolve similar to what's been proposed in a sister industry?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not I have to say I'm not 100% sure I understand the question. So it might be one that we might want to take offline. And my boss Mark Zandy, who I did mention once in my comments. What I mean? I'm not sure precisely what he's proposed for the mortgage sector. I know he does a lot of work in the housing sector and has been a very strong advisor to various housing authorities. But I'm not sure exactly what the mechanism that Mark has proposed is. So it's sort of a little bit hard for me to comment in terms of whether that's appropriate for the auto sector. But anyway, so I'm sorry to have to punt on the question, but nevertheless.
Okay. Very good.
I do invite that gentleman to contact me offline, though.
Okay. Excellent. And just a reminder that we are recording today's webinar, and a link to that recording as well as Dr. Hughes's presentation will be available to you as soon as possible. So keep watch of your inbox for those materials. And during your presentation, Dr. Hughes, you discussed economic shocks and oil shocks, for example. But how does the modeling account for any shifts that a manufacturer might make, be it inventory or what have you, stemming from from those economic scenarios, how does that potential component get factored into the analysis?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question, and I mean, you know, like I am stressing here the benefit. I'm certainly not trying to discount the importance of a subjective assessment, and I am trying to highlight the benefits that stem from a purely quantitative assessment. But one thing that I would point out is that the manufacturer incentives and so forth, what we find is that the data on a macro level for incentives, just as one example, you know, manufacturer suppliers and manufacturer incentives, they do tend to be fairly noisy, and that tends to you know, to detract from the ability of those types of factors to enable us to improve our out-of-sample forecasting ability. The second point I'd make is that there is a huge amount of substitution between different vehicles in the marketplace. And so I would draw a distinction between a supply change for a specific manufacturer, okay, which may or may not have a large impact on the trajectory of supply in the broader market segment, okay, and with an alternative, which is where supply is being curtailed or increased across the entire industry. So the thing is that if Toyota adjusts supply of Camrys in a particular way, that will have an effect on the market, because it is a fairly concentrated market in vehicle manufacturing. But it will be somewhat subdued because of the ability of Honda to adjust supply of the Accord throughout the industry as well. So what I would say is that we are capturing industry-level supply shifts much more than specific manufacturer supply shifts. I think that it's true that there will be. Oh, sorry. I think that it is true that there will be some effects at the margin due to manufacturer supply shifts, but that's the type of response that we think should be done subjectively.
Excellent. And just to clarify, how many variables are included in the model?
Yeah, I mean, like we try to. It's an interesting question. I mean, so we are trying to make it so that the model works for a wide variety of different macroeconomic scenarios. And so we do have a relatively, you know, so we do tend to, you know, so we needed to be able to cope with an interest rate shock, and we needed to be able to cope with a supply shock and a gas price shock and a broader macroeconomic shock and so forth. So the model is specified quite generously, let's say, okay. But what we're trying to do here is to balance the requirement for accurate baseline forecasting with the ability of the model to be able to cope with a wide variety of different stress scenarios. So I know I haven't answered the question. You know, I could have just said, you know, a number, but I prefer to just basically explain the reasoning behind the construction of the model. And I should say that, you know, for any clients of our model, we are fully transparent in terms of the exact specification of the model.
Excellent, excellent. Speaking is Dr. Tony Hughes, the Managing Director of Specialized Modeling at Moody's Analytics. And if you have a question in our closing moments here, please use the questions box on the GoToWebinar control panel. And as a reminder, we are recording today's session, so keep watch of your inbox for a message containing a link to the presentation and the recording, so you can go through the materials again or share it with other people at your operation. And Dr. Hughes, we have a bit of an international audience with us as well, and individual is curious as to how the different factors cause different markets, say the United States versus Canada, for example, to experience different used vehicle volatility. How do, and you referenced in your presentation models from your native Australia. How do different markets behave, and how does that, how are you able to monitor that and create models accordingly?
Yeah, I mean, the comparison to Canada is an interesting one. You know, I must say, there are differences between my homeland and my adopted country, but you know, many of the fundamentals in terms of how the consumer economy works are common around the globe. One feature about the Canadian market that I've always found interesting is just the potential or the likelihood for arbitraging across international borders of vehicles. So, but my understanding from talking to various people in the industry is that there isn't a lot of arbitraging taking place across international borders. So, in other words, if prices are high for vehicles in Canada, will businesses be incentivized to move vehicles across the border and sell them into that country? But my understanding is that there are regulatory blockages to that type of trade taking place. So the markets do tend to be quite separated, but what I would imagine is that in Canada the drivers of behavior would be somewhat similar to those in the US, with some obvious regional differences as well.
Excellent, excellent. Closing moments here with Dr. Tony Hughes of Moody's Analytics, and you've described how many different elements have to come together for the modeling, and a question was raised as how you and the team factor the vehicle value providers and how their data sets might vary. How do you take into consideration those different data points into the modeling structure that you all compile?
Yeah, I mean, again, I guess the devil would be in the details in terms of exactly what what the audience member means by the question. I mean, but again, I mean, what we're trying to do here is, so we're not saying that the subjective element can be completely discounted by any stretch of the imagination. So I think that what some of these questions are sort of driving at is that there is some idiosyncratic feature in the data that isn't very easy to quantify, okay, but is still potentially important nevertheless. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to sort of abstract from that, and we're trying to, do the quantitative work in as detailed and as robust a fashion as we possibly can, okay, and then hand the model results to the final user who can make these types of more subtle subjective assessments in the final determination of the forecast. So there are certainly going to be, we're not saying that the subjective assessment is not required or desirable or necessary, but we are saying that there are various benefits that flow, okay, from being able to access a model that is purely quantitative in nature.
Excellent. That's Dr. Tony Hughes of Moody's Analytics, one of the many experts who's coming to Used Car Week coming up November 14th through the 18th at the Red Rock Resort and Casino in Las Vegas. More details are available at usedcarweek.biz, and as well as what specific parts of the conferences that Dr. Hughes will be a part of. And perhaps as a way to close our time here today, and we thank everyone for joining us, as well as for sharing the materials with other individuals at your companies. Just what are you most interested in as far as what might be happening for the remainder of this year and going into 2017? Just what's piquing your interest most as potentially just of what to watch for, or just from watching the auto finance space in general, what's piquing your interest most?
Well, I mean, obviously, it's the question of whether the leasing sector can land itself on the tarmac gracefully, and you know, and I mean, I think that the signs are actually pretty good so far. You know, residuals have been holding up pretty well. You know, and it looks like activity at the you know, in the new car sector has stabilized this year, and I think both of those developments are very you know, I think that they give me a lot of heart in terms of you know, and my basic feeling at the moment is that the leasing subsector will be okay this year.
Excellent, excellent. Well, Dr. Hughes, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and insights with us. Very great information on a complicated but yet very important topic. So thank you so much.
You're welcome, Nick. Thank you, and thanks to everyone in the audience as well.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, and definitely best wishes for continued success at each of your operations. So thank you so much for joining us.